Out of the blue, my 9-year-old son, Nick, was diagnosed with pediatric cancer. Nick had been complaining of persistent fatigue, and while I never thought it was just regular tiredness, pediatric cancer was the last thing on my mind. From that day, he was forced to be hospitalized for tough treatments.
Just being lazy, right? Trying to gain sympathy with something as far-fetched as pediatric cancer. How attention-seeking can you be?
Even when I told Michael about Nick's illness, he didn't take it seriously. Despite being busy with work, he never once visited Nick in the hospital. My MILF, Susan, insisting that housework is the wife's job, never lifted a finger to help and only complained. Then, one day, Susan and Michael, who had never visited before, came to Nick's hospital room.
You know, cancer can be cured with vitamins, right?
Excuse me.
I found lots of stories online about miraculous cancer cures with vitamins. Like, stage 4 cancer disappeared in a week. So, I'll cure our Nick's cancer.
He took the orange juice Nick was drinking, threw it over his head.
I'm going on a week-long spot rip with your grandma. Make sure you're cured by the time I get back.
Shocked by this unbelievable event, both Nick and I were speechless. After they left, Nick burst into tears, relieved from the fear. Cure cancer with vitamins? What is that even about? And who throws liquid on a sick person? Seriously? Filled with incredible anger, I decided to get back at them. Little did they know, a shocking truth awaited them a week later. I married my first husband, David, when I was 26. He was 4 years older and had been my tutor when I was preparing for high school. After I started working, we reconnected as colleagues. They gradually moved from reminiscing to talking about the future and got married. That's the background of the situation. The following year, Nick was born. Just as our new family began its journey, David passed away due to illness. He had felt fatigue but didn't seek medical attention due to work. One day, he collapsed at work, and upon examination, it was discovered he had cancer. He started treatment immediately, but the disease progressed rapidly, and he passed away 3 months later. Years later, I remarried my current husband, Michael. Initially, I worried about how Nick and Michael, not related by blood, would get along. But gradually, they grew closer, and one day Nick asked if he could call Michael Dad. Surprised, Michael and I exchanged looks, but we knew this was our answer and considered marriage seriously. Our meeting with Michael's parents went smoothly, and they adored Nick as their own grandchild. It was Michael's first marriage, so we invited family and close friends for a wedding ceremony. You would have thought I'd have 2 weddings. I joked with my friends. It was a heartwarming ceremony. However, the seemingly happy in-law family had its issues. Michael's younger brother, who married before us. Michael had moved out when he started working. Marriage was unthinkable, it seemed to be his favorite saying, and his serious brother-in-law decided to take over his parents-in-law's family, got married, and lived with them in the in-laws' house. My mother-in-law, Susan, seems to be at odds with my brother-in-law's wife, Alice, and her complaints about Alice always enter into the conversation, which made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to take sides based only on her complaints, nor did I feel right asking Alice about it. So, I mostly nodded along and ignored her rants. But this seemed to encourage her to increasingly intrude into our home. She started staying over for various reasons, and before I knew it, she was staying over half of the month, and eventually moved in with her belongings. She began acting as if she owned the place, and her attitude towards me and Nick changed. At first, my mother-in-law was kind and understanding to me and my son, she began to say sarcastic things that were not important to us. Before remarrying, I was working part-time, getting by with the help of David's estate. Even after remarrying, I continued working part-time, albeit less frequently, to contribute a little extra. Considering Nick's future, having more money is always better. However, Susan implied that my working part-time meant Michael wasn't earning enough and kept telling me to quit.
After all, you're a mom and should prioritize parenting.
I've never once neglected Nick because of my job. We've managed just fine together. But then, Susan started making snide remarks to Nick.
You're the reason your mom struggles. Your new dad even feels embarrassed about you in public.
She blamed Nick for making Michael feel uncomfortable and started forcing him to do middle school level workbooks, which were too advanced for a child in lower elementary. He hasn't even learned the basics, and she's making him do middle school workbooks. Of course, Nick couldn't answer any questions and ended up crying. She'd even take away his meals, saying his crying was annoying and that boys shouldn't cry so much. Gradually, Nick became afraid of her and started avoiding being alone with her.
What an unlovable brat. He lacks cuteness because he doesn't get enough motherly love. What kind of parenting is this?
She said it so that my son could hear her, so my son would often say sorry and apologize to me. It must have been hard for him that I was being blamed because of him. If I confronted Susan directly, she'd take it out on Nick, so I gradually became unable to voice my opinions. But considering Nick's welfare, I couldn't stay silent. I waited for Michael, who was often away for work, to come home and then shared everything about Susan's behavior. But he didn't believe me, insisting that his mother couldn't possibly say such things or treat a child badly.
You say my mom's terrible, but maybe you're the one being harsh to her.
What?
I've heard complaints. You can handle the housework properly. Since we can live on my income, just focus on the house and stop working outside.
I was baffled. I'd been told to quit my job but had never forced housework onto Susan. In fact, I had never seen her do any housework. She'd just sit around like the lady of the house, ordering me around. She complained about the seasoning of meals, but I'd never had a chance to taste her preferred seasoning. How could I guess flavors I've never tried? I'm not a mind reader. I almost spoke back many times but always held back, fearing Nick would become her target. Gradually, Michael's attitude toward Nick and me became colder. Still, coldness was bearable. Sometimes he'd get so angry it was as if another personality had taken over. He never hit us, but he'd throw things, sometimes hitting Nick. Once, when Nick cried from pain and fear, Michael dragged him outside, saying to stay there until he stopped crying. I shielded Nick, ready to be hit, but luckily, Michael lost interest, muttering it was a turn-off. He must be stressed from work. I fought, believing he'd return to his kind self if he calmed down. I decided to endure, prepared to protect Nick from harm. But it wasn't easy. Amidst these unresolved issues with Susan and Michael, Nick turned 9. He loved basketball and started attending a clinic held by an amateur basketball team. Having something to focus on, and less time facing Susan, he seemed much happier. Then, one day, he started feeling unwell. At first, I thought he'd overdone it with basketball and let him rest, but a week passed without improvement. It seemed to worsen, so I took him to the pediatrician we'd always relied on. They suggested we get more thorough tests at a larger hospital. I was clueless about big hospitals. The only experience I had was when David was treated. The doctor, having connections, wrote a referral for us. I was advised to get a medical consultation as soon as possible, preferably by tomorrow. I was grateful for seeing a familiar doctor first, but at the same time terrified that Nick might have a serious illness. I told Michael, asking him to come with us, but he refused.
It's probably just him faking it. Did something happen at school? If you believe everything a kid says, no amount of money will ever be enough. Big hospitals are expensive, right? Cover it with your part-time income.
I've heard of kids using sickness as a way to rebel against their parents. But would a child fake being sick to the point of not eating well and continue it for a week? Even adults find it hard to fast for a week to make a statement. It requires extraordinary determination. In any case, Nick's illness lasting a week surely meant something was wrong. I had no issue paying with my part-time income and declared to Michael that I would take Nick to the hospital alone. He just responded with a dismissive "do whatever you want," and was visibly upset that evening. The next day at the hospital, they prepared for the worst-case scenario. When I asked the doctor what that meant, they said pediatric cancer. Symptoms can be similar to a cold, including abdominal pain or sudden weight loss. They asked if I had noticed anything unusual, and Nick revealed he had been experiencing joint pain. When I asked why he hadn't mentioned it, he said he didn't want to worry me more or have me face unpleasant comments from Michael and Susan. I felt terrible that he was suffering yet worried about me. Perhaps if I had managed things better with Michael and Susan, I would have noticed the signs of Nick's discomfort earlier. As I reflected on my shortcomings, another shock hit me. Nick's illness was an early symptom of pediatric cancer. He had to be hospitalized, and while preparing for his stay, I informed Michael and Susan.
Pediatric cancer. A worthless burden that costs a fortune. I won't pay a dime.
Cancer hereditary, right? David died of cancer, didn't he? Thanks for passing on such a great legacy.
Michael added coldly. Their heartlessness was beyond belief. Cancer treatments can be quite expensive. Susan was only worried about the cost. Michael even said in front of me that the treatment expenses would come out of my part-time income. I couldn't stand being around these foolish people any longer, so I quickly left for the hospital where Nick awaited. Nick had to give up basketball, which he loved, and his enjoyable school life to focus on the treatment. Fortunately, the pediatric ward had a school, so he wouldn't fall behind in his studies. But seeing other children in much worse conditions was a shock to him.
Will I end up like them? Will I never play basketball again? I wanted to become a star player to make your life easier, Mom.
He felt guilty for burdening me with his illness. It's said that a patient's mental state can influence their condition, so I was advised to avoid making him feel like a burden. I've never blamed him, but maybe my worry showed. Maybe I unconsciously emitted an aura of anxiety that he picked up on. I resolved to bolster my spirits and encourage Nick, who was becoming increasingly disheartened. There were times he cried out, wishing to die rather than getting better. The side effects were so painful that it seemed unbearable. They say even adults find some cancer treatments tough, to the point where they feel like giving up. I thought I understood the hardships of cancer treatment from David's experience, but he hadn't undergone extensive treatment. In reality, I only thought I knew. You can say anything with words. But I wanted to truly support Nick. I sought opportunities to hear from those who had experienced similar situations. We were introduced to a college hospital where I met a student who had survived pediatric cancer. I listened to the person's story and asked what words were painful and what words made him or her happy. and what they wished to hear was incredibly helpful. Despite our struggles, neither Michael nor Susan visited Nick. Frankly, their presence would likely dampen our spirits, so their absence was preferable. However, a bit of concern when I returned home for Nick's clothes would have been appreciated.
Back at the hospital again. Aren't you my wife? Why are you neglecting our home to do this?
The rare times he spoke to me were just to berate me for prioritizing Nick over being a good wife. Whether at the hospital or home, there was never a moment of peace for me. I was constantly on edge, barely getting by on sheer willpower. Amidst all this, my father-in-law, Bob, was the only one who consistently came to visit us. His care for Nick and me, and our light-hearted conversations, allowed us to momentarily forget the harsh reality. I can't be more grateful to Bob. It was also a joy to see Nick, who usually seemed uninterested, smile more whenever his grandfather visited. Bob once confided in me that he had lost a close friend to cancer. Having witnessed the burden on the caregiving family and his friends struggle with harsh treatments, he expressed a desire to help us in any way he could. Just knowing his intentions was enough for me. I wish that Michael and Susan, who I live with, could have even a tenth of Bob's compassion. But expecting something and being let down hurts more, so I decided not to hope for anything. One day, Susan and Michael, who had shown no interest in Nick's battle with illness, came to his hospital room.
How long do you plan to run away from home like a teenage rebel? The house is a mess because you're not there.
A wife has her duties, right? When it's time for someone to die, they'll die, so just leave it be. The cure for cancer is just a matter of luck anyway.
Cure for cancer a matter of luck. Everyone dies eventually. What are those the words you say in a ward where many are striving for recovery? Were they always this despicable? I was so enraged and dumbfounded that I lost all reason. There are things you should and shouldn't say, right? There's a time and place for everything, isn't there? Don't you, who have lived many times longer than Nick, know that? Maybe you both should get a brain scan. Sometimes tumors in the brain can cause personality changes. I remembered some medical drama with a similar plot, though it was a vague memory. I said it confidently, hoping to scare them a bit.
You're insulting the mother who raised me. Your son's weak and got cancer because of your poor parenting, right? I read online that cancer can be instantly cured by just taking vitamins. I'll cure him.
Michael grabbed Nick's half-finished orange juice and poured it over his head. It was a move so unexpected that I couldn't intervene. Nick and I were so shocked that we could only stand there, stunned. Michael and Susan pointed and laughed at us.
I'm going on a trip with Mom. If your stupid son's illness isn't cured by the time we return, who knows what we'll do. Keep that in mind.
Make sure you clean up the house by the time we're back.
They left the room after their one-sided tirade. As the tension eased, Nick burst into tears, overwhelmed by fear. The nurses rushed in upon hearing the commotion, busying themselves with cleaning and changing the sheets. Meanwhile, Nick and I waited in an empty room. I apologized to Nick for making our supposedly normal life, especially our home, a place of fear for him. I regretted my naive hope that reducing contact with Susan could somehow make things better, and for enduring these past years, I apologized to Nick. He comfortingly said he endured the mean granny just like I did, showing his kind nature. I vowed to exact an unforgettable revenge on Michael and Susan for their cruel words to Nick. About a week after making my vow of revenge, Michael called me.
Hey, why can't I get into my own house? What kind of wife locks out her husband? Do you forget who's providing for you?
His voice was so loud, it rang in my ears, even with the phone's volume down. When did that house become his, anyway? That house was inherited from David. Michael suggested we start our married life there since his apartment lease was nearing renewal. He had said we'd eventually move to a new place, but there was no sign of that happening. Before remarrying, a friend of David had offered to buy the house, offering a price above market value. I considered it, thinking we'd move to a new home after remarrying, and Michael might feel uncomfortable in David's house. The offer was tempting, with the location and layout being ideal, and they were willing to meet my asking price. However, I couldn't part with the memories of David and kept the house. I told them we could discuss it again when I was ready to sell. However, Michael never mentioned moving out, and Susan made herself at home, leading to our current situation. I recalled someone saying that memories aren't in things but in people's minds. It's only now that I truly understand that sentiment, albeit a bit late. I should have sold the house when Susan started to overstay. When I approached David's acquaintance about selling the house, although it was belated, they were delighted to help. They even apologized for bringing up the sale during a time when I was grieving. The paperwork for the sale had already been completed. They were considerate about my move and Nick's illness, agreeing to work around my schedule for handing over the house. I was grateful, but to truly get revenge on Michael and Susan, I moved out promptly. I sent Michael and Susan's belongings to their family home, charging them for the shipping. Nick and I took only the essentials and had already moved into our new place. When Michael kept insisting it was his house, I reminded him it was inherited from David and belonged to me. He was momentarily taken aback but quickly retaliated.
Even if that's true, you had no right to make decisions without consulting me. Who lived there with you? I paid for the maintenance, so it's my house.
Living in the house, we also faced issues like poor water flow and faulty toilets, signs of deterioration. He argued nonsensically that because he had paid for some repairs, the house belonged to him. I ignored his reasoning and declared my intention to divorce him. Hearing our conversation, Susan interjected.
What an ungrateful woman. After accepting you, a remarried woman with baggage, as a daughter-in-law, you want a divorce? Women like you are a nuisance wherever you go.
I'm saying I'll disappear from your lives, which should make you happy. Why not just agree to the divorce? You should be relieved to see me go. Be honest for once. Caught by the truth, Susan fell silent. I didn't think this gave me the upper hand, though. I had to be extra cautious and not give them any advantage. When I discussed selling the house, David's acquaintance asked if something had happened. I confessed that I had planned to sell the house inherited from David once I found a new place to live with Michael. However, that was delayed due to his procrastination and Susan's domineering presence. I had given up on mending my relationship with Susan long ago. I admitted my indecisiveness in hoping Michael would return to his former self. The acquaintance, after hearing everything, sympathized with our situation and introduced me to a competent lawyer. The lawyer, very supportive, assured me we'd pursue a divorce that would lead to happiness for us. I initiated the divorce through the lawyer, and Michael eventually agreed, finalizing it. There was a reason David's acquaintance was so helpful. They were executives at a company that did business with Michael's employer, and Michael was the responsible officer for that account. When they requested a change of personnel from Michael's company, he was summoned by his boss, who demanded to know what offense he had committed. The company didn't want to lose a major client. Michael, clueless, denied any wrongdoing. However, upon further investigation by his boss, it was revealed that Michael had a bad reputation, and his colleagues confirmed he had been cruel to his stepson. I heard that Michael was going around telling his colleagues and subordinates that his stepson was weak, stupid, and useless. Just recently, he boasted about curing Nick's supposed pediatric cancer by pouring vitamin-rich orange juice over his head. A subordinate checked the website Michael mentioned, finding it suspicious and linked to a scam recently exposed in the news. The organization Michael was involved with turned out to be the seller of so-called miracle water at outrageous prices. When he was severely reprimanded by his boss, he defiantly responded,
"Does it matter to the company what I do to the kid? It's none of your business."
He even bragged about how he had disciplined Nick. The company pointed out his behavior deviated too much from normal societal standards and told him it was too risky to keep such a person employed in this day and age. He was fired. Later, he heard rumors that an executive at a client company was acquainted with me. In reality, the person was a friend of David, but rumors often get twisted. Panicked Michael sought my help. He showed up at my workplace, unaware of my new address. It turns out David's friend had been making moves, complicating his efforts to find a new job. Even without their interference, he would have had to explain his firing from the previous company. There must have been a significant reason for it. I told Michael, who only came to me when he was in trouble, that he got what he deserved and turned him away. Susan had nonchalantly returned to her family home, but there was no place for her anymore. When I decided to divorce, I made sure to tell Bob, who adored Nick, everything that had happened. He was heartbroken that his young grandson had been targeted and became furious upon learning the truth. The fact that Alice had also been mistreated by Susan came to light, and he finally lost his patience with her. When Susan returned as if nothing had happened, he told her they were getting divorced. Initially, she resisted, but then agreed, thinking it was better to receive alimony than to stay with an unwanted Alice and a husband who no longer cared for her. However, she ended up being the one who had to pay alimony, demanded by her Alice for mental distress. Michael, who had been temporarily staying with Susan, was also kicked out of the family home after Bob discovered their mistreatment of me and Nick. Susan and Michael are now living together in a run-down apartment, surviving as best as they can. He struggles to find steady work, managing only to get by with day labor. Susan, having been a housewife for years, refuses to work, and they are constantly fighting, each blaming the other. Their loud arguments have even led to noise complaints and warnings from the police. Both are to blame. Susan initiated the trouble, and Michael went along with it, but he shares the responsibility from the moment he participated. As for Susan, she seems too stubborn and thick-skinned to be affected by any downfall. After everything was settled, Bob visited me and Nick once. He was deeply apologizing for the actions of his wife and son. He wished us happiness and quietly gave me some money as compensation, which I initially refused. But he insisted, saying it was the least he could do since he couldn't be there to see Nick recover. Once I divorced, Nick felt a sense of relief from being free of the fear and control of his stepfather and grandmother, and his mood stabilized. The doctor started noting his good condition more frequently as he became more positive. Having goals helped him endure tough treatments without complaints. His efforts paid off, and he was granted temporary discharge. If there were no issues, he could gradually return to normal life while continuing treatment. Over time, his condition further stabilized, allowing him to attend school with some restrictions. Though he sometimes needs to be hospitalized, it's not for as long as before. He sets small goals for himself, like things to do or eat after his hospital stays or treatments, focusing on his recovery. This school and its students are understanding and supportive, giving me peace of mind when sending him there. I feel relieved and happy seeing his steady recovery. Now, I'm determined to walk towards greater happiness with Nick, side by side.